Okay, so originally there were no egos. And then if we go back to, let's say, the origin of original times of Kali Yuga, there was ego, but it was dharmic ego, all right? Now, if you live in a society like ancient India, where the individual person made almost no decisions of their own. Everything was decided by the family you were born into, the gender you were born into, and the caste that you were born into. And that would determine what you did for a living, who you would marry, and that was determined by the families involved. There was not an individual, oh, I want that one, or there was none of that. So the ego had no scope to develop, because the ego is about making decisions, right? And all the decisions were made by the Dharma and by the social order. You just lived it out in as beautiful, as noble a way as possible. But the script was written. And so there was no anxiety or worry, because the society also took care of you from cradle to grave, as they say. You didn't have to buy insurance. You didn't have to worry about unemployment, whatever. You had your life taken care of by the social order. And the Dharma took care of whatever possible conflicts there were. Everything was already managed. So the ego's life was simply a life in which you would bring the most beautiful manifestation of that map of reality into time, right? But it was already a given. So gradually, as that system began to fall, because the pillars of the system were the Brahmins, were the ones who didn't have power. The power was with the kshatriya, the kings and the queens and the warriors and all of that. But they were like the prophets in the biblical world, who maintained the Dharma, the order of the Dharma. But as they began to have their own desires for power and for prestige and all of that, this infected the entire system. It affected the kshatriyas, the vaishyas, who were the merchants, and the artists and the artisans, etc., and the shudras, who were the workers in the fields and who did the manual labor, etc. So the whole system began to rot from the head, and as it did, then the egos had to develop, especially in the kshatriya, the royalty, to maintain the nobility of the system, regardless of whether the spiritual integrity was intact among the Brahmins. And so the locus, or the center of social power, shifted from the Brahmin caste to the caste of the kshatriyas. The Buddha, for example, was a kshatriya. He was one of the first of the great yogis who was not a Brahmin. So this shift to the caste that was based not on liberation, as the Brahmins were, but on nobility, the Aryan, right, idea, that, and the noble truths that the Buddha presented. This idea created for the first time a positive kind of shame. In other words, it was a shame if you didn't live up to those noble ideals any longer and were contaminated by a fallen culture in certain areas. And your job now was to support it with nobility. So shame came in as something that was actually not toxic. It was actually something that gave you some of your motivation if you lost your belief in the Brahmins and in the myths that were being presented as the source of the gods and the goddesses, who were no longer there. They were no longer present, right? So the shame came in as a way of holding people to the ideals that they were pledged to sustain. But then as that caste also began to fall, then shame became used as an instrument of control. And now you were shamed if you failed to fulfill the demands of the royalty, etc. And so then the penance became something that was interpersonal. It was no longer between you and God any longer, or the nobility of your race, your beingness as manifestations of God consciousness, but now it was much more on an egoic level. And people then began to shame one another. And then the shame, as it fell down into the lower castes, became a way that parents could control the children through shaming them and saying, bad boy, you're the brat. And then they could keep the child's behavior under control because the Dharma no longer functioned. And then, of course, it just became used as a kind of a sadistic mode of making the other subservient. And so the whole social system became sadomasochistic gradually, which is where we are now, and shame is almost universalized as a toxic master emotion, as we talked about in that teaching. So that's how it evolved, and it was originally something not bad, but that replaced the Dharma, and now it's the most anti-dharmic emotion possible. Okay, does that help?